Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes for some more attendees to join, but this is the Stonewater webinar to mark Rural Housing Week 2020. My name is Stuart MacDonald. I'm the Managing Director of CMedia, and I'm going to be the event chair today. I'm just going to wait a minute or two for more people to join. I can see there's lots of you there already, which is great. There's a poll I think we've asked people to be having a look at while we're waiting too. So if you have a look in your menu control panel at the side, you see a poll. We should be asking you to have a look at that just now. Just launch that just now. There we go. So yeah, if you can have a look at that, maybe answer that question, that'd be great. Thank you. We'll give that a minute and then we'll put up a second question as well. Okay, I can see most of you have voted, which is great. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to close that one now, and there's one more question we're going to ask you as well. Okay, here we go. What do you consider to be the main barriers to be, if any, for rural housing projects? Please, if you can all have a look at that and answer that as well, please, that'd be great. Okay, that's most people in now. We've got more than 100 people attending today, which is great. So thank you all very much for taking the time. Okay, again, that's most of you voted in that poll, so that's great. Thank you very much. We'll share the results of those now as well. Here we go. So in terms of the main barriers for rural housing projects, there's some interesting results there. Land, again, being the main thing. Nimbyism, our old friend, coming up again. Now, here we go. Okay, so the majority of you are involved in rural housing projects just now, but some people looking for opportunities too, so that's great. Okay, so like I say, hello to those of you just joined us now, and welcome to this Stonewater webinar to mark Rural Housing Week 2020. My name is Stuart MacDonald. I'm the Managing Director of CMedia. I'm going to be the event chair today. As you all know, this week is Rural Housing Week. Sadly, the COVID-19 situation means we can't mark and celebrate this week face-to-face as we might have done. So as a leading housing provider in rural communities across the country, Stonewater was keen to ensure we could still bring people together to discuss the key issues affecting rural housing. And we've got a fantastic panel here today to help us do just that. Joining us to share their insights today, we've got Nicholas Harris, who's the Chief Exec at Stonewater, Monica Burns, who's the Head of Member Relations at the National Housing Federation, Martin Collett, who's the Chief Executive at English Rural Housing, Shan Griffiths, who's the Director of RCA Regeneration, and Jonathan Lazel, who's the Exec Director of Development at Stonewater. Now, I'm really grateful to them all for being here today to share your expertise. A couple of quick more points from me before I hand across to Nick. There's going to be about 10 minutes for Q&A and discussion at the end of the webinar, so please do use the questions box to post any questions you have in there. And I'll pick those up at the end of the webinar. You may not be able to see all the questions that appear there, but don't worry, they're all being received and we'll get through as many as we can. Finally, after the webinar, you're going to receive a recording of the webinar as well as the slides and a short publication about rural housing from Stonewater. Okay, that is enough from me just now. I'm going to hand over to Nick Harris just now to take us through his slides. Just bear with me 2 seconds so I can get those up. Okay, I'm just going to close this. There we go. Okay, so Nick, it's over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is another first for me. First time I've actually spoke on a webinar in this format. So during the lockdown, we've all done many firsts, and this is about my 5th or 6th one this week. So great to see everybody today, and thank you for joining us. Stonewater, rural housing's in our DNA. It's something that we've done since we were formed in the 1960s, and we've done over all previous years, and we intend doing in the future. Our vision is that everybody has the opportunity to have a place they can call home. That is a particular challenge in large parts of rural England, where the affordability ratio is enormously out of kilter for the local community. So as I said, rural housing is in our DNA. We do a whole range and have done a whole range of rural housing schemes over the years, from rural exception sites to land and build to 106s, from large gazetted areas of less than 3,000 homes to very small hamlets. So if we can move on to the next slide. COVID-19, or the pandemic as we now call it, has had a huge impact on our communities, and it's just really exacerbated the inequalities that there are in our society and community, including housing inequalities. So the people that have been most adversely impacted, whether by the virus or by being furloughed or losing income, are generally our customers. And that actually is, in our view, is actually even more sort of serious in rural communities where there's been no real infrastructure to support people during the pandemic. So we're really determined to make sure, moving forward, taking advantage of the Chancellor's speech today and the additional affordable housing money that's been made available, for us to do what we can in our rural communities, whether that be for us in rural Herefordshire or Devon or Cambridgeshire, or up to the Yorkshire National Park up in Rydal in Yorkshire. So we're determined to do whatever we can to help and support our rural communities. And our work really moving forward is to continue to champion the sector and rural communities. So that's all I want to say today. I was going to pass over to Monica from the NHF, and there's some really fantastic speakers today who will be talking about the work that they're doing with our rural communities. So I will hand over to you, Monica, and listen to your presentation.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me today. And also, I really appreciate Stonewater putting on this webinar for us, because as Nicholas said, we usually do have a get together, but because of coronavirus, we weren't able to this year. So it's fantastic that you've given us this opportunity to get together remotely. So I've been asked to speak about how the pandemic has impacted on rural communities and exacerbated the existing issues. And I was thinking about this, and the full impact isn't going to be known for a while. It might be months, it might even be years before we see the full impact that coronavirus has had on rural communities and other communities. But I thought what I'll do today is take a look at the immediate impact that we have seen already, and also what is likely to happen. So affordability in rural areas has long been a problem. We've got an uneven playing field. We've got higher house prices in rural areas than in urban areas, and lower incomes. A lot of the work in rural communities is part-time and seasonal, therefore the incomes are lower. And Martin later on has got some really good statistics on this, and so I won't steal his thunder, but just to put it in context, that's the how we're operating. We've got a lot of second homes, holiday homes, and people retiring to the rural communities. Obviously, these people come in and they've got more money than the local people, and therefore that can inflate the prices of properties in rural communities. Now, what we've heard is that there's been an increase in popularity of rural living triggered by the pandemic. In fact, and it's quite startling actually, Savills have said there's been a 90% increase in demand from house hunters for country locations in the last 3 months compared to last year. I mean, obviously everybody's been working from home, and so we've realised that we don't have to trek into the office every day. So that frees us up where we can live. People have been squashed in small houses, they want more outside space. So everybody's thinking, I know, let's move to the countryside. And also the chance of actually contracting the pandemic is much lower if you're actually living in a rural area. So what we're worried about is, or a worry could be, that this could make the playing field even more uneven, with these people with higher incomes and maybe bigger deposits, etc., moving into the rural communities. It could actually make this playing field more uneven. Can I have the next slide, please? So communities and the pandemic. So what has it been like living in a rural community during this pandemic? As we know, rural areas, the population is skewed towards older people, many of whom have been self-isolating and shielding. And the service provision to those people then has been really difficult, obviously, in dispersed rural communities. And it's actually highlighted the need for affordable accommodation for those carers and key workers within the community, within the rural communities. Access to medical help and carers and everything has been made much more difficult. So tourism is one of the main industries in a lot of rural communities, and this has had a real hit. Obviously, the main season for tourism is from Easter right through the summer till the end of the summer. And a lot of these tourist industries actually make the money during this season to see them through the winter. Obviously, with many, many weeks of income lost, we're just not sure, and they're not sure whether they will be able to bounce back, whether they will be able to survive that, whether they will be able to make enough money in the short season that's left. So again, this could lead to a closure of many industries and many tourist attractions within the rural communities, and therefore a loss of income. Another issue in rural areas that we're all very concerned about is the lack of broadband. This has taken a real hit with more people working from home in the rural areas, and also homeschooling. Kids have been struggling to log on to do their lessons, whilst parents have been trying to log on to work, etc., etc. And very interestingly, the online doctor's appointments as well. This has been quite a new idea where you can't access your doctors, so you have an online appointment. And as we just said, that the rural areas population is skewed to older people. So this would have been ideal in rural communities for these people to be able to access a doctor online. But unfortunately, it wasn't possible for many of them because of the lack of broadband or the poor broadband. Could we have the next slide, please? So the sustainability of rural areas relies on the use of local services. So a couple of years ago, the National Housing Federation published the Rural Life Monitor, and we found that rural services were incredibly in decline. The stats are up here. Rural schools, one closing every 5 weeks, rural post offices, more than one closing every month, and rural pubs, 7 closing every week. And this was before the pandemic. Now, we know that a lot of people who come into the rural areas who are using the second homes and holiday homes don't use the local services. They'll stop off on the way on the big out-of-town Tesco and stock up. Obviously, they've got their own transport, they don't use the bus or something. So these local services rely on the local population to use them. And they've played a key role during the pandemic. There's fantastic case studies, and they're all on the Rural Housing Alliance website, about pubs doing takeaway food, about shops setting up food banks, doing delivery of medical supplies, the meeting space, obviously socially distanced meeting space, but to actually combat loneliness and isolation. And community businesses are uniquely placed to understand the diverse needs of their communities and then offer diverse solutions. So they must be protected to make communities sustainable. And by building more affordable homes, that is the way to make them sustainable. Next slide, please. So Nimbyism, yeah, and as this poll showed that we just did before we started this seminar, obviously is of a great concern. It is alive and thriving, unfortunately, and often consists of really well orchestrated funding campaigns. I've been to so many parish council meetings where an eloquent minority have stood up and argued really hard for no affordable housing. There's no easy way out of this, but we've found that to inform and educate is a good way to actually make progress. You can show these NIMBYs, you can show these people that are against the development, completed developments, the really beautiful high quality housing that housing associations build in villages that actually enhance the village, that actually bring something different to it. Obviously, sometimes it's a fear of incomers, and it explaining that this housing that we're actually building is for people that are actually living in the community already, but in substandard housing. The Rural Housing Alliance have published a guide for parish councils which takes through step by step the whole process and how to get the community engaged right from the beginning to the site identification, the housing needs survey, the design of the properties, the building materials, etc., etc. And it is really worthwhile having a look at, and it does help with the Nimbyism. But obviously, I've just talked about a possible influx of new rural incomers from the towns and cities, and the worry is that they won't have an understanding of rural life and it could exacerbate the problem. So hopefully it won't happen, but we are aware that Nimbyism could actually increase and get worse. So that's something to be aware of. Have the next slide, please. So this is old Boris, build, build, build. And that's exactly what we want to do. We want to build the right properties of the right tenure in the right places, and rural housing associations are well up and ready to do this. So construction was frozen during the pandemic, but most sites now are back on site. Social distancing is making that they're not making as much progress as they were before. There's an issue with construction jobs being lost and damaged to the supply chain. Also, lots of rural housing association use small local firms, and many of them have had to furlough staff and hopefully are going to be able to bounce back, but they are still vulnerable. With the predicted recession that is being forecast, we are concerned that there might be less demand for shared ownership homes and low cost ownership homes. Now, a lot of housing associations do deliver these tenures and use the profits that they make from them to reinvest and cross-subsidise to build affordable rented homes and social rented homes. So if there's a fall in demand for shared ownership and low-cost ownership, we're worried that there will be less money to cross-subsidise and build more affordable rented and social rented homes. We've also got the issue of right to shared ownership and first homes as well. We know that this government, Robert Jenrick, is very, very obsessed with home ownership and is pushing it in all its different guises. We are arguing really hard that right to shared ownership, that rural areas are exempt from right to shared ownership. And we're also arguing that first homes is first piloted in certain areas so that we can see what the impact is before it's rolled out. Next slide, please. So this pandemic has highlighted the need for high quality, beautiful, affordable homes to rent and buy. And we know that the best way to stimulate the economy is through building homes. They provide jobs, provide services and homes. So it's also a really good way to lever in money. As we say, as you see on this slide, it says last year the sector secured £13.5 billion of new private finance, which is £6 for every pound of public funding. So it's fantastic investment. And we're currently working with the government. We've got a new HP, it's been Affordable Homes Programme, it's been extended by a year. But one of the things that we're pushing the government for is increased grant funding. As I said previously, if we do have a fall in right to shared ownership and we're going to have less cross subsidy. We also want the flexibility of tenure, because at the moment, as we say, we don't know how the recession is going to impact. So there might be better demand for shared ownership or there might not, but we want to actually be able to turn the tenure of properties according to need. And also, obviously, most importantly, we're pushing to safeguard the current rural affordable housing programme. So next slide, please. So the National Housing Federation has just launched this campaign called Homes at the Heart. Now, it's a national campaign and it's a coalition one, and it's calling for once in a generation investment in social housing. And this campaign links to the recovery work, our recovery work at the moment, and the 5 points are here: no return to rough sleeping, a new generation of affordable homes, helping people to thrive at home, a new drive to decarbonise social housing, and change for communities across the country. Now, there's rural issues running through each of these strands of work, and we'll be working with the Rural Housing Allowance to make sure that we cover all the different rural impacts and all the different rural work streams within these overall issues. And we'll be working very, very hard over the coming months and years to make sure that rural areas get the housing that is needed for their local communities to thrive. Thank you.
Okay, that's great, Monica. Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to hand on to Martin Collett now. Martin, over to you.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you to Stonewater Housing as well for organising today's webinar. So looking at my first slide, what I was asked to cover were the main challenges to delivering affordable rural housing. Those of us working in affordable rural housing will know we could spend the whole hour talking about this. I've got a minute to cover it, so I've narrowed it down to three of what I feel are the top challenges that we all face, and I was relieved to see these listed as well in the poll that Stuart conducted earlier on. So looking at the first one, so local politics and Nimbyism. So what we find in rural areas is to be successful in delivering affordable rural homes, we need local leadership at district and parish level, and that's an essential ingredient. When that's missing, it means that things just don't happen, things don't get built. And a good example of that is perhaps where districts plan for affordable rural homes when they're thinking about their housing strategy, and when they don't, those that do tend to have a higher level of delivery than those that don't, that actually see affordable housing delivery as windfall, as ad hoc, something that happens by chance rather than something that they plan for. And I always cite Ashford Borough Council, who English Rural work quite closely with, when I talk about this. So what Ashford Borough Council do is have a cycle of working with each parish in their district, where they carry out a housing needs survey to understand what the housing needs of that community are, and then they plan, typically using the rural exception sites policy, to deliver homes, and because of that they have a programme of rural delivery over any given time, and have achieved quite high numbers of affordable rural homes in the district. Moving on to Nimbyism, this is something Monica picked up on, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. But what I would say here at English Rural is possibly our biggest challenge. English Rural tend to work in the southeast mainly, and quite a lot of the counties we're working in are what you would call commuter belts, so bordering sort of London, very high property value areas, and what we tend to be facing, partly because of that, is well-resourced, well-informed and fairly militant groups opposing what we want to do in partnership with the community. These groups are normally in a minority, but actually have a voice that's disproportionate to what they're representing. And to be a bit controversial, in my experience, generally they use environmental credentials as a veneer to prejudice about what the houses are going to look like and who is going to be living in the houses. Looking at land availability and cost in rural areas, typically trying to deliver on a market site just isn't viable because the costs are so high. So there is a reliance on the rural exception site policy, and that's becoming increasingly challenging. It's difficult to find sites, and those difficulties are principally coming along because of changes to planning and housing policy. So we've got the exception site, we've got local authorities looking to put together a 5-year land supply, we've got the voluntary right to buy, and now, as Monica said, we've got the potential for the right to shared ownership. all of which creates nervousness amongst the communities who want to deliver a certain tenure to meet a certain need, and also nervousness amongst the landowners as well, who want to make sites available at a reasonable cost, but actually don't want to do so if things are going to change down the line. So land availability is becoming a real issue for English Rural, and I know for other rural housing associations as well. Planning, infrastructure and viability. What we tend to find is that planning policy still prioritises urban solutions to rural housing problems, and this comes back to the point I made earlier about planning for rural housing to delivery. Rural communities are quite often simply redlined because they're considered to be unsustainable. Now, in my view, that's looking at sustainability in a fairly archaic way, because we all live and work differently, and the current pandemic showed how that actually could change more. So we need to look at sustainability in a different way. Also looking at small rural sites, you tend to find that infrastructure costs are high because the number of houses being delivered are low, and you've got to put quite a bit of infrastructure in there, whether it's roads or off main sewage treatment. You're normally building off gas as well, and that isn't always represented in the level of grants that are made available. And when you've got Homes England promoting volume and numbers, and looking at value for money, quite often rural can be overlooked because the costs of delivering it can be seen as higher. Just moving on to my next slide, what Monica mentioned earlier, and thank you for not stealing my thunder, Monica, was the acute affordability issues that face rural communities. Those of us working in the rural housing sector will know all of this. It's not a surprise to us. We know that property values compared to household incomes are more severe in rural areas. We know that there are less affordable rural homes to start with, 8% compared to almost 20% in an urban area. And we know they're being lost and not replaced. So, for example, between 2001 and 2011, the number actually fell by 1%. And it's reasonable to assume that has continued since, driven by the discounts on right to buy. So there's few of them, and they're being lost at a quicker pace than we can actually build them. There's not enough investment from the government in affordable rural homes. It's got better over recent years. So looking at the 2021 Affordable Homes Programme, around 13% of delivery, that's not investment, that's delivery, was in small rural communities. But these are communities housing 18% of the population. So what we would like to see is an increase of that 13% to 18%. So it's equitable and represents the proportion of people living in those communities as well. And also those of us living in rural communities recognise from the outset that actually, it's more expensive to live in small rural communities where access to transport is limited. So you're relying on your own transport, whether it's a car, to get around. We see that fuel costs are higher, heating homes is higher. You don't have access to big supermarkets easily, so you're normally paying a premium if you're shopping and buying locally as well. So affordability is a real issue in rural areas. Looking at my next slide, how do affordable rural homes keep communities alive? Again, those of us working in the sector will know all of this. It won't be a surprise to you. You've heard from Monica the positive impact that affordable rural homes can play on local services and economy, and English Rural's own research into the social value that our developments secure for a rural community demonstrated that for every £1 we invest in a rural community, the community benefits by £6.50. So actually investing in affordable homes has a real impact and can make a real difference, but also it can keep a balanced community, a range of age groups, income earners, keeps family and friend networks together to tackle issues like loneliness and isolation. And the impact and benefit of that couldn't be clearer than what we've seen over recent months as we responded to the pandemic. Having those networks, having access to those services has been critical to rural communities, which would otherwise have been cut off because actually it's more difficult for them to access those services that are in urban areas. Rural communities need all sorts of people, and all sorts of people need all sorts of homes, including affordable homes. So moving on to my final slide, I wasn't really asked to put this together, but I sort of did it anyway. This is my wish list. If I had a wish list for affordable rural housing, what would it be? Well, it would be investing more grants in delivering affordable rural housing and encouraging more housing associations to proactively include rural within their growth ambitions as well. Through local government, it would be to encourage a focus on leadership, that leadership needed to deliver and initiate an affordable rural housing programme, and not just see it as windfall or a bonus when they come along. Also protecting the affordable homes that we do have, so protecting them from the right to buy, protecting them from the potential damage that right to shared ownership could cause as well. And also, I think, to make sure that rural housing does feature in any national recovery plan. I mean, build, build, build. Monica has said herself that rural housing associations are ready to be part of that recovery, to invest our own money in building more rural houses. We just need to make sure that we're seen and we're heard, and we actually are part of that solution as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Martin. Okay, moving swiftly on to Shan Griffiths. Shan, if you're there, I'll hand over to you.
Afternoon, everyone. Okay, so I'm giving a consultant's perspective on rural housing delivery, and my perceptions, and they are my perceptions, are generally skewed by my experiences of trying to deliver planning permissions for registered providers in rural areas, and we work throughout the UK. So just moving on to the first slide then. So these are just a couple of little snapshots of rural housing in the news. If anybody thinks that delivering affordable housing in rural areas is easy, then tell me your secrets, please. I do tend to get wheeled out when things get a bit more difficult with planning authorities, and more often than not I like to be involved from the word go, because I think it is entirely possible to get planning permission for rural housing schemes in the right location. But the challenges are generally Nimbyism, in my experience, a complete lack of understanding as to who the people might be that would be housed in these schemes, and also, which is something that hasn't perhaps been mentioned, is occasional jealousy over landowners selling land at a profit. And land, of course, is a very expensive commodity in this country, even if it is to deliver affordable housing. If I could have the next slide up, please. So if you're planning to deliver affordable housing in rural areas, the number one piece of evidence you need, above and beyond anything else at this stage, very early stage, is need. What is the need for your scheme? Now, housing needs surveys are an important factor in all of that, and depending on how up to date they are, it may be the parish council have already undertaken one, and you need to take a look at that. Do they ask the right questions? Do they actually genuinely inform your approach to a rural housing scheme? If they don't, you may have to do one from scratch. We do them ourselves to inform schemes, but it is only part of the story, and you do need to interrogate choice-based lettings data, which is called different things, but it's essentially the demand for relets and the bid data on second-hand affordable housing stock in a particular parish and or neighbouring parishes, because of course there can be coordination between parish areas. That is data that's held by the council. The right to buy data, right to acquire losses to the authority are not necessarily published, and we often have great difficulty getting hold of that information because it's often held by registered providers, sometimes the perhaps former ALMO for that local authorities, the Arm's Length Management Organisation, or the Stock Transfer RP. They have very valuable evidence on losses and a right to buy, and it's often not included in the calculations of affordable housing need for a particular local authority area. I've come across this time and time again, but once you get hold of it, it can really inform just how acute affordable housing need is in that particular local authority area. The fourth point, and a need, is assessing and trying to get information out of the hard to reach groups. Of course, they're not called hard to reach groups or referred to as hard to reach groups for no reason. They are hard to reach. And it isn't simply a case of sending out questionnaires to people like that. They don't do questionnaires, they don't do engagement. It may be a case of going out and door knocking. I am in particular quite keen on getting more RP customers, registered provider customers, involved in the process of determining need, because they can give information on their wider family, indeed friends, carers, and parts of their network that perhaps would have a functional need to live in that particular location. So housing needs surveys, postal surveys, they have a place, and they are important, and we do use them, but they're only part of the overall picture. And to just assume that one would need to rely on a housing needs survey or postal survey is not the way to go about it. Indeed, it's likely to only give you a very small proportion of what the real overall housing need is. Finally, it's already been touched on, objector participation in the planning process is significant. Objectors will often be very well heeled, very articulate people, and once they get the bit between their teeth, they will not go down without a fight. And it's how do we counter this if we're working for developers and RPs. Personally, I think that the group, the cohort that we are representing here, those that are in affordable housing need to have much more of a voice as part of this process. And over the 20 odd years I've been doing this, the one thing that is lacking is tenant and future customer participation. Where we've done redevelopments of schemes that maybe were former council housing developments, and we've re-provided on site and then added more affordable housing to that scheme. Those that are going to be moved out and moved back in, they're very, very vocal, very involved. You know, make use of your tenant groups, make use of the resident groups you already have to try and build on and build capacity and get them involved in representing themselves and maybe helping through advocates like ourselves, helping them to get their point across about how acute the need actually is. Can I have the next slide, please? Some of you may be well aware of what a rural exception site is and what an entry-level exception site is. Entry-level exception sites are a relatively newcomer to the scene in terms of affordable rural housing delivery. I'm not going to teach grammar how to suck eggs, but rural exception sites are different to entry-level exception sites. And I've made reference to the National Planning Policy Framework and those specific paragraphs which refer to both forms of affordable housing development. Now, they are to be located on sites where housing would not normally be permitted, the word exception being, of course, the important bit here. So where there is no allocation in the local plan or development plan. The differences are, some may consider to be relatively subtle, but it is important to know the difference between the two. Entry-level exception sites cannot be in what we class as footnote 6 designation areas, so they can't be in green belt or areas of outstanding natural beauty and so on. And I've quoted directly from the NPPF there, where I say that it is, or they say, sorry, it is suitable, an entry-level exception site is suitable for first-time buyers or those looking to rent their first home, unless the need for such homes is already being met within the authority's area. These sites should be on land which is not already allocated for housing and should comprise of entry-level homes that offer one or more types of affordable housing and be adjacent to existing settlements proportionate in size, not compromise the protection given to, and we've referred to those areas or assets of particular importance in the framework, the footnote 6 designation areas. and comply with local design policies and standards. So there's a lot to get over, a lot of hurdles to get over to get an entry-level exception site. But they are less about meeting local need and more about meeting more generic need within the authority area as a whole. They are an interesting prospect, and I've not seen many of them, I have to say. But they are interesting insofar as they are perhaps a little more, they could potentially deliver more housing on individual sites at a time, albeit there is a limitation on the size of entry-level exception sites of 1 hectare and no more than 5% of the existing settlement size. Now, I take that as meaning numbers of households in a particular settlement, but that is, of course, a part of the NPPF that has been defined. So that may be a watch this space, but be interesting to hear if anybody's got any different experiences on that. But rural exception sites are considered to be small. They are defined as being small in the NPPF, requiring local need to be demonstrated. Rural exception sites can also be in Greenbelt or AONB, so they are not excluded from those footnote 6 designations. They can happen within those areas. So there are differences and there are some similarities, and I would strongly urge you to have a look at options relating to the rural exception site versus the entry-level exception site in terms of delivering any affordable housing you may be interested in delivering. Have the next slide, please. So I'm being, as usual, antagonistic by using the computer says no lady here. I have to say, I've worked with some absolute gems as far as planning officers and local councillors are concerned. But unfortunately, in the main, I generally tend to find that a lot of them are trying very, very, very hard to find ways to say no. I think a lot of it's down to the perception of what affordable housing means to people, particularly those that don't need affordable housing. I've listed a number of barriers that I consider a potential issue for RPs looking to deliver rural housing. There may indeed be some planning officers listening in on me today thinking I'm being massively unfair, and I am in some cases, because I think there are an awful lot of planning officers and district councillors and parish councillors who do get it, who do understand. And certainly housing officers in the main are generally pretty supportive. If we identify need, they will be extremely helpful in providing additional data, etc., etc. Neighbourhood plans are worth just bearing in mind, because if they do make allocations and they do work from a robust evidence base, it may be that it can be proven by a parish council that they don't actually have a need for a rural exception site. So that's perhaps something to be borne in mind as well. Neighbourhood plans have the same status once they're made as the local plan itself. So they are much more powerful than, say, the old style parish plans. So don't forget about neighbourhood plans. Bear in mind where they are at within their plan making process as well, because weight to be afforded to them increases as they go past certain milestones. I've found, and again, I'm generalising, but local plan policies do rarely seek to instruct the delivery of affordable housing more generally, and it's how they are interpreted. But I agree, with the point that Martin made earlier on about how it's often geared around urban affordable housing delivery and not rural affordable housing delivery. Viability is another massive planning barrier, and it's a whole different topic area we could talk at great length on all afternoon, and we're not going to do that now, but we as a company are very well versed with have a development in a specialism in development as well, and look at development viability for various organisations. Viability is often underpinned by and motivated by landowner expectations, baseline land values. Also, perhaps complicated by the availability of grant funding opportunities and the need for cross-subsidy of these sorts of schemes through the delivery of market housing. Very rarely there are site abnormals as well to take account of, and it's not simply the case that schemes can afford to deliver everything that they originally perhaps set out to deliver. Have the next slide, please. My little whistle-stop tour of planning problems with rural housing. I've moved on to planning appeals. Do not be afraid to appeal, because ultimately that's often your only option. It may be that you've had a very sympathetic planning officer and housing officer who've done their level best to recommend approval, to get the scheme looking tickety-boo, and it hasn't mattered one jot because the parish council and the local district councillor have been absolutely opposed to it from the word go. And in that respect, you may end up with a committee resolution to not to approve, but ultimately you get a refusal. And where do you go from here? If you've got all your ducks in a row and there's nothing else you can do about it, you really do have to appeal. I have had some issues with some RP clients where they're concerned about rocking the boat and not upsetting the local authority that they consider to be a partner of theirs. But I've turned the mirror on them and explained, well, where's the partnership working if ultimately their members are going against officers and refusing you? You've got no other option. I will often advise going for costs, but sometimes that's a bridge too far for RPs as well, where they want to appear ultimately to be a friend to a local authority and a delivery partner. And I understand that. But the planning inspectorate at the moment are adapting really well now to the COVID-19 crisis, and they're up and running with virtual inquiries and hearings. The first lot got underway a couple of weeks ago, I think it was, they started, and they're going great guns now. It has been a bit suck it and see, but you know, written reps generally haven't been delayed too much. There has been a delay to site visits where PINS, the planning inspectorate, did pause site visits for a while by inspectors. That's started back up again and they are getting on with things. So I wouldn't worry too much about backlogs and delays. If you have no other option, please do consider appealing. Please give me a ring and I can talk to you about your options. You've got written representations, hearings, inquiries, and now hybrid appeals, which allow for a little bit of both. They're almost a sort of pick and mix style appeal where certain aspects of it can be run under an exchange of written representations, where you may then have a hearing element, which is very, very focused. And it's a much more efficient way of getting through the matters that are important and the main issues. Just remember your evidence, evidence, evidence. Don't try and take something off to appeal where you may choose to rely on evidence you want to bring later on. Make sure it's all up front. Give the council everything you've got. Put everything on the line at that point, and don't expect to be able to get away with bringing new evidence to a planning appeal. And in the event that you've been badly treated, the council have not acted reasonably, do not afraid to go for costs. You shouldn't be having to lodge appeals at your own expense where, you know, all day long it should have been an approval and the council have not provided evidence to justify why they've refused you. Next slide. And that is it. So any questions later on, let me know. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm just conscious of time, Jonathan. I do apologise. We are at 10 to 4, so I'm going to ask if you can make your points as quickly as you can. Apologies, we're running out of time a wee bit, but I'll hand over to you now, if that's all right, Jonathan. And thank you, Shan.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. Hello, everybody. I think Nick talked about rural housing being in our DNA, and he's right. For me, this is a really personal thing. I've been working in rural housing for 20 years, having sort of first come across affordability as an issue when I was doing a project locally as a student while at university, and that's how I've arrived here, really. Stonewater now is a really large programme. If we could have the next slide, please, Stuart. Stonewater is a really large programme. We're looking to deliver 1,500 homes per annum from next year, and that's not all rural housing, but our commitment to rural housing remains in spite of that large programme, and it remains a significant part of what we do. In fact, before the pandemic intruded, we were aiming to celebrate our 3,000th home since the formation of 3,000th new homes since the formation of Stonewater in 2015 down in Winterbourne Abbas in Dorset earlier in the year. So we've had to do our celebration of rural housing online. and this is a really interesting way, I think, of doing that. So I think what underpins that commitment to rural housing is our willingness to engage with local stakeholders. And we've heard quite a lot about Nimbyism, we've heard quite a lot about resistance locally, but there is also a really important group who are underrepresented in those communities too often, and that's the people who really need those new affordable homes. So we tend to think, and I know this is reflected in the way that my team thinks about it, that we're going into bat for those people each time that we try to put in place a new affordable housing scheme. We think local engagement is really important. We think local partnerships are really important. And we recently completed some work with a community land trust down in South Petherton in Somerset, where we were the first housing association to tap into Homes England's Community Housing Fund to the tune of about £500,000. And I think in relation to the Nimbyism question, what we don't allow is for ourselves to be sidetracked by the vocal minority. And we are very happy in the way that Sian's described to take these things as far as they'll go in terms of planning appeals and such like, where we think that the need for the affordable housing is outweighed by the volume of resistance to it locally. So we like to try and engage positively with local communities. We would not want to impose a solution on them, but I think we do need to recognise that that Nimbyism is often only a vocal minority, and we need to make sure that for the future sustainability of our communities, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, the future sustainability of our communities, that we have mixed and balanced communities. So I think the other thing is that because we've got such a large programme, we can have a number of these schemes running at any one time. So there's a picture there on the screen now of a scheme at Barton St David in Somerset. I think we completed those in about 2013 or 14. And I think I started working on that in about 2007-8. So they weren't the only houses we built during the time period. If they were, I probably wouldn't have a job for very long. So I think there's about 10 properties there in Barton St David, but that's made a real transformational difference to that community. If we could have the next slide, please, Stuart. So our focus is on rural affordability. We like building mixed tenures. So we build a bit of social rent, we build a bit of affordable rent, we build some shared ownership, and we're also doing some rent to buy, which is relatively unusual. But what is important to us is the affordability, but also that long-term commitment is reflected in using the local supply chain. So we make a long-term commitment both to the communities in which we work, but we also make a long-term commitment to our contractors and other consultants, because we think that we're making a real difference to rural communities and the rural economy in terms of the investment that we're making. And for each home we build, we think we support between 1.5 and 2 jobs within the community, and that might be a rural community, it might be an urban community, but Stonewater is operating across England. Our long-term commitment also goes beyond the simple completion of the homes, because as a housing association, we're in this for the next 25, 30, 50, 100 years. And therefore, the way that those properties slot into the local community, the way that the design complements what's there already is really important to us, and that creation of a sense of place is really important. So we make a commitment to planting at least one new tree on site for each new home that we build. We also are committed through our work with the Community Forest Trust to plant 5 trees off site. So recognising some of the environmental impact of building the new homes. And sustainability is really important to us. If we could have the next slide, please, Stuart. And sustainability is a sort of really multi-layered word, and the current climate has really made me reflect on this. When I started doing this job or working in housing 20 years ago, people used to talk about rural sustainability in terms of, is there a bus service there? And what's become obvious over the last 4 months is that, you know, bus services are really important to rural communities, but actually having fast broadband, as somebody who lives in a rural community, my ability to do my job at the moment, working from home, is dependent on me having good quality, fast and reliable broadband. So those sorts of investments in infrastructure are really important. And I think what's also been important to think about over the last few months is the way in which we use space inside and outside the homes. And what's great for us about rural delivery is we usually have a bit more space outside to play with. We usually deliver lower density housing with more outside space, but we're also increasingly looking at what the energy demands of the future are likely to be. So this is some illustrations here of a scheme that we're working on, which has got planning. It's about to start on site. We own it in US Harold in Herefordshire, 38 affordable homes. And the big focus for us there has been on both ground source heat pumps in the ground to provide the majority of the heating, but also PV panels, photovoltaic panels on the roofs to provide some electricity. And we are also putting in smart thermostats there to both give us, as the housing association responsible for maintaining the properties, real-time information about whether that heating system is working properly, but also over time allowing people to tap into the most affordable energy source for them at a particular time of day or at a particular time of the year. And I think we're going to be seeing an increasing number of those. And I think we'll see housing associations lead the way on that, because housing associations are very interested in the long-term perspective in terms of investment. By investing in the right heating sources now, we prevent ourselves from having to come back in 5, 10, 15, 20 years and replace what we're putting in. That's a bit of a whistle stop for me because I'm conscious of time, but Stonewater's commitment to rural communities will, I hope, endure. Thank you very much for listening.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Jonathan, and thank you everybody else. Okay, so we're going to quickly have a couple of questions picked up from the presentations. Now, there's a couple have come in about entry-level exception sites. Now, this is maybe quite a technical one, but there's been something from Debbie Eland at a local authority who's asked how we can ensure that you get affordable housing from entry-level exception sites. I'm just wondering, I don't know, Jonathan, do you have any experience of that at all?
I think from a technical point of view, it's probably more Sian's area.
Sian, do you want to pick that up then briefly, please, if that's okay? Oh, is Sian still there?
Sorry, can you hear me now? Forgot to demute myself. I don't know if that's a word actually, but there we are. No, I just wondered whether there was the concern that over whether or not they could be delivered through the normal Section 106 agreement or an appropriately worded housing condition, because I can't see why they wouldn't.
Yeah, again, we've not picked up on that, but perhaps Debbie can get in touch with you directly about that. There was another question from Richard Smith, actually, just wondering about entry-level exception sites generating a land value. Is that anything you can help him with, Sian?
Well, they do generate a land value. They would generate a land value above and beyond that. Can you hear me?
Yep.
You can hear me, sorry. I can't see why they wouldn't generate a land value above and beyond that, which would typically be a baseline land value of agricultural land. What is it that they're after? Do they want a sort of an idea of what it would generate above and beyond that, versus market housing delivery? Or because we have got experience of valuing these sites, we're in the process of valuing one at the moment to inform an RP's purchase. But I mean, obviously I can't give a figure out, but they do generate a value. Is that what they're after? Or?
Yes, and then the question is
sorry,
yes, please go on.
What we're finding at English Rural with entry-level exception sites is they're disrupting our traditional supply route, which is rural exception sites, because actually we're finding that landowners and landowners' agents are advising them of this alternative, where actually the affordable criteria, if I understand it correctly, there needs to be a sort of discount from market value, but not to the extent that a housing association is delivering in terms of affordable rent or even some social rent. The discount could be, for example, first homes, what's that, 30% from the sale value, and they are sort of tailored towards affordable home ownership. And because of that, they're demanding a higher premium than the traditional rural exception site would. So it's raising expectations with landowners that they'll get more money for their land. And because of that, the traditional rural exception sites, that they're starting to be impacted, not in all areas, but certainly in some of the areas that we are working now. So I think it's something to watch and to monitor. And again, I think, if I understand correctly, what it said in the NPPF is the impact of entry-level exception sites would be looked at and would be reviewed, so it could be fully understood in terms of how it was going to affect delivery of genuinely affordable homes.
Okay. Yeah, and that would, sorry, can I just add to that? A local authority would add delivery of entry-level exception sites into their annual monitoring report anyway, because it is a form of affordable housing delivery.
Okay, thank you, Shan. Just one for you, Martin. Just maybe a last one from Duncan Harvey at Sedgemoor, who's asking how we could maybe evolve away from grant reliance in terms of building affordable housing in rural communities. Maybe a big question, but you talked a bit about looking to the future, so I wondered if you had any thoughts there. Then maybe, I don't know, Nick or Jonathan, if you wanted to put in that too.
And you can do it in certain areas easier than other areas. I know at English Rural we've had some developments where they've had zero grant go in, and we've blended the tenure to have some affordable rent, some shared ownership, some discounted market products, and some market products. So what we've done is we've worked with the community to understand what the broadest housing needs are in that community, the whole spectrum of them, and we've developed a site to meet that, where zero grant has gone in. So it can be done. It's much more challenging to do that in low value areas, because it only sort of stacks up and works from a viability point of view if you can generate the surpluses, the profits, if you like, from the affordable home ownership product. And of course, in low value areas, it's very, very challenging to do that. So those areas, I think, are always going to need to attract some sort of grant, but it can be done.
Okay, Nick, did you have any thoughts on that at all? Or Jonathan?
Yeah, I think Martin's right, that it comes down to being more possible in higher value areas, where perhaps the rents or the market value of a shared ownership property are higher, and it's also dependent on you being able to access the land at the right price. So it is possible on a rural exception site, if you buy the land at £5,000 or £7,000 a plot, and then you've got your build costs. If you can recover your land and your build costs and your on costs in terms of the revenue that you get back, a mixed tenure type development can operate free of grant. But I think overall, if you're providing a sub-market product, you need the subsidy to come from somewhere. It either comes from the planning process, and exception sites are a product of that, as are larger affordable housing quotas on market sites, or it needs to come through an element of public grant subsidy. And we've got an announcement this afternoon or a reiteration, if you like, of the £12 billion commitment from the government to affordable housing, which is very welcome.
And just finally, Monica, did you have any thoughts on that from your wider membership? Obviously, you talked a lot about the work that people have been doing to be creative in communities and to try to improve and sustain them. Any further thoughts in terms of just how the options are open to housing providers in terms of that?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that then, actually, and also with the possibility of the right to shared ownership. I think that delivering right without grant might become more popular, because if the right to shared ownership does get through, then any property delivered with grant is going to be open to shared ownership. So I think housing associations will be looking at other ways to actually fund rather than grant if it does get through. But as I said, we're hopeful for a rural exclusion. But yeah, I mean, to be honest, the only real way is cross-subsidy, and without the market for a cross-subsidy, it's very difficult.
Okay, all right, I'm really conscious of time. We said we finished by 4, we've overrun slightly, so I'm going to call proceedings to a halt there, but just say thank you all very much for attending today. There's been some good questions coming in. Everybody will receive a recording of the webinar and also the slides, and also a short rural housing publication from Stonewater too. On behalf of the panel, thank you all very much. Thank you to the panel, obviously, and thank you to Stonewater for organising this today. Thank you very much.
Thanks.